Hi everyone, I'm really pleased to be able to participate in this workshop. I'm very much looking forward to hearing about what everybody's working on and to reading that work. I'm presenting my paper titled Reckoning and Rehabilitation, Confronting Democracy's Foundational Flaws. My paper is in response to Jean-Paul Gagnon's impressive undertaking, collecting democracy's words and building a database out of this, which he sets out in the Sciences of the Democracies. So by way of a brief introduction to the argument I develop in the paper and here in this presentation, I construct an argument in response to some of the stated aims that Gagnon has in his database. So some of the purposes of gathering this impressive amount of data is to better understand the meanings and practices of democracy itself, something that we clearly do need to be doing. Another aim is to avoid limited and arbitrary understandings of democracy. The hope is that in having this very substantive amount of data that we can have a much deeper, more enriched sense of what democracy can and does mean. And then in doing so, to open up more democratic possibilities, something which it's clear that is definitely needed in the world today. My entry point into this conversation is to start with a really big question, to ask why is democracy itself valuable in the first place, and to ask what it is we want to do with these definitions of democracy that Gagnon is gathering. I do this from a critical perspective and from the standpoint of a political theorist, with the recognition that the democracies that we have, that we're looking at, are themselves often very deeply flawed. And so the question then becomes, okay, well, we're gathering these different conceptions of democracy, and if all of them or most of them have significant problems, what does that mean for the way in which we approach the data, from what we hope to get out of it? So in asking this question, why is democracy valuable? I hope to keep some core normative concerns at the forefront as we're engaging in this very specific work of looking at what we actually have, the different conceptions of democracy. So my argument that I'll develop here is that this undertaking that Gagnon's engaged in, one that's very important, this collecting and analysis of the different of democracy's different words, the different conceptions of democracy that are out there. This collection, analysis, and the broader narrative all need to confront foundational challenges to democracy. And this needs to be kept, I think, at the forefront of the way we approach the database. And I'll get into why that's the case as I go through this presentation. But I mean, the main takeaway for now is that democracy's use, the conception, the words of democracy that we currently have and that we're gathering, this use is at odds and fundamentally at odds with systemic justice and meaningful equality. And that is something we have to deal with head on. To develop the context of this argument, it's important to look at the normative underpinnings of democracy. The reason we value democracy is because we think it's the best way to meaningfully act upon the sense that all people are moral equals, and as such ought to be treated as moral and political equals in our institutions. However, we know that there are problems trying to put this into practice. We know that democracy's designs uphold particular and exclusionary conceptions of power. And not only do they actually do this, there are significant inequalities and exclusions in democratic institutions, but that's not an accident. It's by design, which I'll push on later on in the presentation. So actual democracies end up running counter to normative ideals of democratic equality, and losing sight of this normative need to treat people as moral and political equals. When we engage in this normative analysis and look at the implications of uncovering this tension between what it is democracy ought to do, treat people as moral and political equals, and what it actually does, which tends to be make a mockery out of those principles and serve the interests of people who already have power, then we are faced with a very substantial problem. And that means that it's not enough to construct narratives from the data that we're gathering, in large part because the data itself is harmful in the ways that I've just pointed to. While it's really important to push further on the state of democracy, to figure out what's wrong with it, what we need to really keep at the forefront is that the problems with the state of democracy go far beyond disorder, which is something that we might be able to fix with some careful curation of this kind of gathering work that Gagnon engages in. We need something else, I argue. The more fundamental challenge is that democracy isn't very democratic, at least when our focus is on why, normatively speaking, democracy ought to matter. Now, identifying these problems doesn't mean that we ought to abandon Gagnon's project, far from it. What we need to do is to think really critically about the type of narrative that we hope to construct from the database. I argue that it's not enough to build a new narrative from the component parts. What we need to do, and I'll push on this toward the end of the presentation, is to make sure that once we have this data, we actively start dismantling it. We start really picking apart the different conceptions of democracy that we're gathering so that we can have new component parts. Because if we recognize that the component parts, the democracies that we're gathering, are deeply, fundamentally flawed, then we don't want to build with that material. That will just lead us to a different, but still not particularly normatively helpful, understanding of what democracy is. Now, the structure of the paper and the presentation is to, first of all, look at why democracy, to talk about the normative foundations, and after that, to speak to how we might dismantle these structures, these fundamentally flawed conceptions of democracy that we're gathering, how we might rebuild, and importantly, how we might use the database to do so. I realize this is an incredibly long introduction into the paper, but I will just speak a little bit to these different parts as I push on this argument. As I ask this question, why is democracy valuable, and push on these normative underpinnings, I look at deliberative democracy as a case study. Some key points here are the ways in which deliberative Democrats, as they argue for reasoning together between people who are free and equal in order to exchange arguments and come to reasoned conclusions. Deliberative Democrats rely upon principles that are rooted in equality and treating people as moral and political equals. So in many ways, it's an ideal case to look at these normative questions, given the lens deliberative Democrats try to go to meet them. So some of the core underpinnings of deliberative democracy include mutual respect and mutual justification, as these form a basis for deliberative democratic legitimacy. Now, the tension that I set out at the beginning of the presentation is something that we see in deliberative democracy when we pick at it a bit. While we aim to treat people as with mutual respect and use mutual reasoning to come to conclusions, the problem is that when people are engaging in deliberations, they are necessarily doing so against the backdrop of structural injustice. They're deliberating in the real world. And so this raises really substantial problems, and ones that I argue deliberative democracy doesn't do enough to address. Despite deliberative democracy's recent embrace of deliberative systems, which aim to incorporate the background of the real world into how we conceptualize deliberative democracy itself, which also aim to expand and deepen inclusion, and despite recent reinvestigations of the way power works in deliberative democracy, there are still major systemic and structural problems that prevent the realization of mutual justification and mutual respect in a really meaningful sense. And a big part of that problem is because as deliberative Democrats are still dealing with inclusion into systems, even if it's a better inclusion, a richer inclusion, the problem is the systems themselves are the problem. And that problem is something that deliberative democracy hasn't yet really dealt with to the extent that it needs to. As we see these structural and systemic problems and injustices playing out in a way that makes inclusion always inherently insufficient, it's because we're talking about inclusion into a system that itself is fundamentally flawed. So when I look at foundational challenges to democracy, I'm drawing on the work of people like Carol Pateman and Charles Mills, who look at the ways in which conceptualizations of democracy were deliberately constructed by and for people who already had power as a way to maintain that power. The articulations of democracy that people take for granted rest on principles that deliberately devalue and dehumanize significant sections of the population. The idea of genuine democratic equality, of treating all people as moral and political equals, is not only missing from these foundational conceptions of democracy, but it's intentionally left out. These foundational conceptions of democracy are intentionally designed to maintain a hierarchy, an exploitive, dehumanizing hierarchy. And that's part of these butterflies, if we're using that terminology. It's part of what we're capturing when we are gathering different democracies, different conceptions of what they are. So what then are we meant to do if the democracies that we're gathering are these Dr. Frankenstein's democracies that are deliberately constructed in a mockery of any meaningful sense of moral and political equality? We cannot, with that knowledge, rely upon gathering these different words and coming up with a more meaningful and normatively rich narrative about what democracy is and what democracy ought to be, if we're just relying upon these materials. So what then does acknowledging this foundational problem mean for working with the database? We can still work with the database, I argue, in very rich and meaningful ways, but we need to engage in a deep critical analysis and use this recognition of foundational problems to rehabilitate democracy in very intentional ways. As we engage in this critical analysis with respect to the database, and I try to wrap up the presentation, there are three key things that we can try to do. The first is to recognize the importance of tracking the way each democracy presents itself. What are the claims and what is actually happening on the ground? So the core arguments that Mills and Pateman set out. We need to make sure that we examine core assumptions embedded in each conception of democracy. We need to catalog the foundational exclusions as they exist, and we also need to catalog the ways these manifest. We need to look at the bigger picture, and we can use the database in some really productive ways here to draw from this large collection of data to learn new things about different conceptualizations of democracy. So along the lines of how critical race theory, Black political thought, feminist political theory lets us see the kinds of arguments that Mills and Pateman make, we can learn from democracies to expose the kinds of contradictions and shortcomings in the ways democracies present themselves versus what they actually do. And connected to this, we need to make sure that we take seriously contributions from justice-based work, not to lose sight of the reason why it is we are engaging in this project in the first place. Why do we want to build a particular narrative? What value is this narrative going to give to our understanding of democracy, and why democracy itself is valuable? All right, thank you very much.